All right, everyone, welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're really zeroing in on families, specifically how families can help their school-aged kids become better readers.
Mhm.
And we've got some really fascinating research to kind of unpack here. This is all about what are called family-implemented literacy interventions.
Yeah, that's right. We're looking at a brand new analysis. Well, brand new as of January 2025 when it was published. The title's a bit of a mouthful. It's called Examining the Effects of Family Implemented Literacy Interventions for School-Aged Children, a meta-analysis. But basically, think of a meta-analysis as a way to see the forest for the trees, you know? It takes a whole bunch of different studies, pulls all their results together, and tries to give us a really solid idea of what the evidence is actually saying overall.
Yeah, exactly. And meta-analysis is like the ultimate research roundup, right? We need to see those big trends. So your mission, if you choose to accept it, listener, is to come away from this deep dive understanding some of the most effective things that families can do to really boost their kids' reading skills. And all of this is happening at home. We're not just talking about reading aloud, although, spoiler alert,
Yeah.
that is definitely a part of it. But we're going to look at the different ways that families can really actively support literacy development.
Mm.
And this is for kids of all ages, kindergarten, all the way through high school. Though I will say, a lot of the research we're looking at today tends to focus a bit more on those younger grades, so elementary school. All right, so before we get into the nitty-gritty, why is this such a huge deal? Why are we even talking about this? Why is this deep dive so important?
Well, right off the bat, the meta-analysis highlights this pretty concerning trend. They start by pointing to a statistic from the National Assessment of Educational Progress. This was back in 2022. And basically, it found that a really big chunk of school-aged kids in the U.S. are reading below proficient levels. Like, it's a lot of kids. And that's something we should all be concerned about, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of people listening probably have a sense that reading difficulties, it's not just about like, oh, they're going to struggle in English class. It can have this kind of ripple effect across their whole lives, can it?
Exactly. It's so much bigger than just, struggling with a book report. The study actually points to research showing that kids who have trouble reading, well, they're way more likely to struggle in other academic subjects too, which makes sense. They tend to have higher dropout rates. Their chances of going on to post-secondary education, whether that's college or vocational training, are lower. And there's even research suggesting that reading difficulties might be linked to some emotional and behavioral issues down the road. It's like
Yeah.
strong reading skills, they're the foundation for so much in life.
Yeah, I mean, you're painting a pretty clear picture here of why figuring out effective ways to support reading development, well, it's vital.
It is.
And especially for those of you listening who are all about gaining knowledge efficiently and thoroughly, really understanding how families can help make that happen, that's super key. So before we jump into what this new analysis actually found, let's make sure we're all on the same page here about like the basics. How do we even learn to read in the first place? What's the science behind all of this?
Right, let's break it down. A really good starting point is something called the simple view of reading.
Okay, simple view.
Yeah, it was this idea put forward by these researchers, Goff and Tunmer, back in 1986, and honestly, it kind of lives up to its name. It boils reading comprehension or understanding what you're reading down to two main things. First, there's word reading. That covers all those skills for decoding words, like phonics, knowing how letters and sounds work together. And then second, you've got language comprehension. That's your ability to make sense of what those words and sentences actually mean, the ideas and concepts they're conveying.
So it's like you need both sides of the coin. If either one of those is weak, your reading comprehension is going to take a hit.
Precisely. Think of it like baking a cake. If you're missing sugar or flour, it doesn't matter how great your frosting is, the whole thing's going to fall flat.
Okay, I like that analogy. Cake is always good.
Right. And to get even more specific about what goes into those two main ingredients, we can look at what's called Scarborough's reading rope. This was from 2001. Imagine a rope, but it's made up of all these different strands, and they're all twisted together to make this strong, unified rope. On one side, you've got those word reading strands. That's things like, being able to hear and play with the sounds. In words, we call that phonological awareness. Then there's understanding how letters and sounds connect. Phonics, remember? And being able to sound out words or decoding, that's a big one. But then on the other side of the rope, you've got the language comprehension strands. And that includes stuff like, your background knowledge, what you already know about the world. It also includes your vocabulary, how many words you know, and your understanding of grammar or syntax, how different types of texts are structured, like a story versus a news article, and your ability to think critically and reason about what you're reading. All those strands have to work together, and they have to become kind of automatic for you to be a truly skilled reader.
Yeah, so when we see a kid struggling with reading, it could be a problem with any one of those strands, or maybe even a bunch of them together.
Exactly. And that's why it can be so tricky to figure out what kind of support a particular child needs.
Okay, so we've got this, kind of basic understanding of what goes into reading, but
Yeah.
where does the family fit in here? Because it can't just be on schools to teach kids to read, right?
Absolutely not. Schools are crucial, but they're not the whole story. To really understand the power families have, we can look at this idea called the bioecological systems framework. This was developed by a guy named Bronfenbrenner, and he basically said that a child's development is shaped by all these different layers of their environment. The innermost layer, the one closest to the child, is called the microsystem. This includes all the direct interactions a child has with people in their closest surroundings, family, teachers, and in places like their home and school.
So, like their most immediate world, their daily life.
Yeah, exactly. And here's the key point. The thing that makes this framework so relevant to our discussion today, it emphasizes that what happens at home, those everyday experiences and interactions, have just as much influence on a child's learning as what happens at school. I mean, that just highlights how huge the potential is for families to support their children's reading.
Yeah, I think you just kind of blew some minds there. People often think of school as the primary place where kids learn, and home is where they relax and de-stress. But you're saying they're both equally important learning environments.
Exactly. The home isn't just a place to unwind after school, it's a continuous learning space.
Okay, that's a really cool way to look at it. So this new meta-analysis we're talking about today, it's not like researchers are just now discovering that families play a role in reading, right? I mean, there have been other studies looking at this before. What did we learn from those earlier studies?
Yeah, you're right. There's a history here. The authors of this meta-analysis, they actually talk about some of the previous research. One they mention is a meta-analysis from 2008 by Seneschal and Young. That study found that, yeah, family-based literacy interventions, they do have a positive effect on how well young kids learn to read. And one interesting thing they found was that those positive effects were even stronger when families were actually like hands-on, actively involved in teaching specific literacy skills, as opposed to just, reading aloud.
Okay, so it's not just about passively being around books, but really engaging with them in a targeted way.
Yeah, more intentional, more focused. And the meta-analysis we're looking at today, it points out that since that 2008 study, a lot of the research on family literacy has really zoomed in on shared book reading, which, is great. And most of those studies have been done with younger kids, like birth to pre-K. And these interventions often focused on building those language comprehension skills we talked about earlier, things like vocabulary, understanding the sequence of events in a story, being able to retell it. And there's definitely evidence that reading together can boost that side of reading development.
Makes sense. But it sounds like this new study, it's trying to give us a broader picture, right? Like, what about school-aged kids, and what about all those other literacy skills?
Exactly. This new meta-analysis really narrows its focus to those kids in kindergarten through 12th grade, although, as you mentioned, it skews younger, and they look at a much wider range of literacy skills. We're talking about those foundational skills, like being able to sound out words, and those higher-level comprehension skills. So it's giving us a much more complete picture of how families can help throughout a child's time in school.
All right, so let's dive into the specifics. What exactly did this new meta-analysis look at? Give us the research rundown.
Sure. So they looked at 25 different interventions. These interventions were spread out across 22 individual research papers, and all these papers were published between 2000 and early 2024, so pretty up to date. Now, 12 of these studies, they were what we call group design studies. They basically compared a group of students who got a family literacy intervention to a control group. A group that didn't get the intervention, and they looked at, how they compared on reading measures. The other 10 studies, they used a different approach called single-case experimental designs. These are more focused studies that really track just a few students very closely as they go through the intervention. So they're looking at individual progress in a lot of detail.
Okay, so we've got a mix of approaches here, both those big group studies and those smaller, more individualized ones. That's interesting.
Yeah, and it's good to have that mix because it gives us a more well-rounded perspective on what the evidence is saying.
Okay, and what kind of skills were these interventions actually targeting? Like, what were they trying to help kids improve?
Well, they covered a pretty comprehensive set of skills, honestly. Things like phonological awareness, which remember is that ability to hear and manipulate sounds in words. There was decoding, spelling, text reading fluency, which is like how smoothly and accurately a child can read out loud. They looked at vocabulary, listening comprehension, and of course, reading comprehension, making meaning from what they read. So a lot of ground covered.
Yeah, it sounds like they hit all the major bases there. So what did they actually find? What happens when you pull all of this research together? Did they find any overall trends or like big takeaways?
Well, let's start with those group studies. The studies where they compared, big groups of kids. Overall, they found that these family implemented literacy interventions, they did have a significant positive effect on kids' reading skills just in general. Like there was a noticeable improvement for the kids who got the interventions. Now, to be a little more technical about it, they calculate something called an effect size, which is basically a way to quantify how big of a difference the intervention made. And for those group studies, they found an average effect size, and they used the letter G for this, of 0.36, which is considered to be like a small to moderate effect, but importantly, it was statistically significant. That means it's unlikely to just be due to random chance.
That's encouraging, right? Right off the bat, we're seeing that involving families can make a real difference. But did they look at whether that effect was bigger for some types of reading skills versus others?
Oh, yeah, they did. When they looked specifically at those code-focused skills, remember, those are things like phonological awareness, decoding, spelling, text reading fluency. The average effect size was a little bit smaller, G equals 0.28, but again, it was still statistically significant, meaning it's a real effect.
Okay, so it's helping with those foundational skills.
Yeah, and when they looked at the meaning-focused skills vocabulary, listening comprehension, and reading comprehension, the average effect size there was actually a bit bigger. It was G equals 0.41, and that was statistically significant too.
So a bigger boost for those higher level skills, understanding what you're reading. Makes sense.
Yeah, and they actually broke it down even further. Do you want to hear those?
Oh yeah, lay it on me.
Okay, so for phonological awareness, specifically, they found an average effect size of G equals 0.37, and that was statistically significant. For decoding and word reading, it was G equals 0.19, also statistically significant. For spelling, it was G equals 0.24, but that one wasn't statistically significant. And they think that's probably because there weren't that many studies that looked at spelling specifically.
Okay, so not enough data to really say for sure on spelling.
Yeah. For text reading fluency, the average effect size was G equal 0.27, but again, not statistically significant, likely because of the smaller number of studies. Vocabulary had a significant average effect of G equals 0.26. Listening comprehension was G equals 0.39, but that one wasn't statistically significant. And then reading comprehension had the biggest effect of all those meaning-focused skills, G equals 0.53, and that was significant.
Wow. Okay, so reading comprehension really popped in those group studies.
Yeah, it did.
What about those studies that focused on individual students, those single-case experimental designs? What did they find there?
All right, so those are really interesting. Overall, they found a huge positive effect on literacy skills, like really big. We're talking an average effect size, that G again, of 1.50. That's much, much larger than what they saw in the group studies.
Whoa, okay, so a big difference there. What about for specific skills in those individual studies?
Okay, so for text reading fluency, they found a significant positive effect, a really big one, actually. G equals 1.80. For decoding and word reading, they found a positive effect, G equals 0.86. But this one wasn't statistically significant, and the researchers point out that this is probably because very few of the individual studies actually focused on decoding specifically.
So not enough data there to really draw a firm conclusion on decoding.
Right.
Okay, but a really strong signal for text reading fluency. Now, why do you think we're seeing such a big difference in the size of those effects, between those big group studies and those smaller individual studies?
Well, the researchers have a few ideas about that. One thing they point out is that almost all of those single case studies, they focus specifically on students who are already identified as having reading difficulties or who were considered to be at risk of developing them. So it could be that those students, because they were already struggling, had more room for improvement with that targeted support, compared to the groups of kids in those bigger studies, which would have included a wider range of reading abilities. Another reason might be the types of interventions that were used in those single case studies. A lot of them really emphasize text reading fluency, often using something called repeated reading. That's where a student reads the same passage over and over again, trying to improve their speed and accuracy each time. And it could also be that the way they measured outcomes in those individual studies was just more sensitive to the specific skills that they were trying to teach compared to those standardized tests that are often used in the big group studies. Those standardized tests, they kind of cover a broad range of skills, so they might not pick up on subtle improvements as easily. And then finally, it's possible that in those smaller studies, because they're so focused on individual students, they might have just done a better job of actually implementing those interventions. Like maybe there was more support for the families, more careful monitoring of how things were going, and that could have led to bigger effects too.
Yeah, it makes sense. It seems like the context of the study and like the specific focus of the intervention, those things can really make a difference in how big of an impact you see.
Absolutely.
So what did these family literacy interventions actually look like? Like, what were some of the common elements across all those different studies?
Okay, well, across the board, whether we're talking about those big group studies or those smaller individual studies, there were some themes that popped up pretty consistently. Most of these interventions, they involved giving families some kind of training up front, like explaining the intervention, teaching them how to do it, giving them clear instructions, and also giving them the reading materials they would need to actually carry it out.
Okay, so making sure families felt equipped and supported, not just throwing them into the deep end.
Exactly. And the sessions themselves were usually pretty short, like 10 to 20 minutes, and they were typically done fairly consistently, maybe 3 to 5 days a week.
So sounds pretty manageable, right?
Yeah, definitely not asking families to carve out hours and hours each day.
Okay, were there any big differences in how those interventions were set up between the group studies and those single case studies?
Yeah, there were some interesting differences. In those group studies, a lot of the interventions focused on reading comprehension and text reading fluency. And some of them just involved parents reading aloud to their kids, good old-fashioned story time. But there were also some interventions that focused on decoding, word reading, and vocabulary. In the single case studies, on the other hand, they tended to put a bigger emphasis on text reading fluency, often using that repeated reading technique we talked about, and also on decoding and word reading. And as we mentioned, those single case studies usually involve students who were already struggling with reading.
Okay, so the interventions were often kind of tailored to the specific needs of the kids in each type of study.
Yeah, it makes sense to adjust the approach based on what the kids need.
Now, this meta-analysis gives us a lot to work with. But were there any limitations that the researchers pointed out, like anything we should keep in mind about what these findings can and can't tell us?
Oh, absolutely. Every study has limitations, and this one is no exception. One thing they found really surprising, and you alluded to this earlier, was how few studies included older kids, kids beyond elementary school. Like, they initially wanted to look at interventions for kindergarten through 12th grade, but they just didn't find that many studies that focused on those middle school and high school years.
Huh. That is surprising.
Yeah. And they kind of speculate that maybe it has to do with how the relationship between parents and teenagers changes. As kids get older, they might be less open to that kind of direct involvement from their parents, at least when it comes to academics. And there is some research that supports that idea.
Yeah, teenagers and parents, not always the smoothest combination.
Right. But they also point out that there's other research that suggests that even for older kids, spending time with parents, quality time, can still have positive effects on things like reading. So it's a bit of a mixed bag there.
Sounds like we need more research on those older age groups.
We do. Another limitation they pointed out was that most of the studies included in their analysis were published before 2017, with only a couple from those more recent years leading up to their data collection cutoff in early 2024.
Okay, so maybe there's been a bit of a slowdown in research on family-implemented interventions.
Yeah, it seems like there could be. And they acknowledge that, the overall number of studies, while it was enough to show some general trends, was still on the smaller side, which meant that it was hard to really dig into all the factors that might influence how well these interventions work. Like they couldn't really look at the impact of things like the child's age or their specific reading difficulties in a ton of detail.
Right, so the findings are promising, but we need more research to really get the full picture.
Exactly. And then the last limitation they mentioned, and this is something that comes up a lot in meta-analyses, was that sometimes those original studies didn't give a ton of details about the interventions themselves. Like they wouldn't always describe the training that families got or exactly how often the interventions were done. And sometimes they wouldn't even report on the reading skills of the family members who were doing the intervention. So that makes it a little harder to draw super precise conclusions.
Okay, yeah, so while this meta-analysis is super valuable, It also kind of points the way for future research.
Hmm.
So if someone's listening to this, what are the key takeaways they should walk away with? What does this actually mean for parents and educators in the real world?
Okay, so big picture, the most encouraging takeaway is that, yeah, getting families involved in supporting literacy at home can make a real difference for kids, especially for those elementary school students. And that includes helping them understand what they read, which, remember, is that ultimate goal of reading.
Yeah, comprehension is key.
Absolutely. So, for educators or really anyone who's thinking about setting up these kinds of family literacy programs, this research suggests that, probably the best place to start is with those kids in kindergarten through second grade. And it's crucial to make sure that families have a lot of support, clear training on how to do the intervention, really specific step-by-step instructions, and all the materials they need to actually carry it out.
Give them the tools to succeed.
Yeah, set them up for success. And based on those studies, it seems like keeping the sessions relatively short, like those 10 to 20 minutes, and doing them pretty frequently, like 3 to 5 days a week, that seems to be a sweet spot. But I cannot emphasize this enough. Every child and every family is unique. So tailoring the approach to fit their individual needs and really paying attention to how the child is responding, that's critical. You have to be flexible.
Yeah, it's not one size fits all. You've got to meet kids and families where they are. Okay, so that's some super helpful, actionable advice. Now, looking ahead, what are some of the big unanswered questions? Like, where do we need more research?
Oh, there are a ton of questions still out there. As we've discussed, we desperately need more research on those older kids. Like, how can families effectively support middle schoolers and high schoolers? We need to figure that out. It's also super important to have more studies that focus specifically on English language learners, kids who are learning English as a second language, and students from low-income backgrounds, because, those groups are often at higher risk for reading difficulties. And the researchers also suggest looking into those independent literacy activities that kids can do at home, like just reading on their own, for pleasure, and also the role of those computer-based programs that families can use.
Yeah, like how do those fit into the mix?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Another interesting avenue they point out could be looking at those book giveaway programs, but specifically for older kids. We've seen some success with those programs for younger kids, so it would be cool to see if that translates to older age groups.
Yeah, would be interesting.
And maybe most importantly, we need more long-term studies, like studies that follow kids over a longer period to see how long those effects of family literacy interventions really last. That would be really valuable.
Yeah, because ultimately we want to set kids up for success, not just in elementary school, but for their whole lives.
Right. And then there's some really interesting questions about like the nuts and bolts of these interventions. Like, is it better to give families really detailed scripted instructions, or is it better to just give them some key tips and let them adapt it to their own family style? And what happens when you combine, really strong literacy instruction at school with that consistent support at home? Like, how do those two things work together to create the best possible outcome for kids?
So lots of exciting areas for future research to explore.
Yeah, lots to learn.
But for now, it seems like we've got a pretty solid body's evidence saying that, yeah, family involvement matters. Getting families engaged in supporting literacy at home, that can have a real positive impact, especially for those younger elementary school students, and especially when it comes to boosting reading comprehension.
Absolutely. And I think, what this really highlights is that helping kids become strong readers, it truly is a team effort. Schools are important, but the home environment, it plays such a huge influential role too. And for you, our listener, I hope this deep dive has given you a clearer sense of what the research says about how families can really make a difference in their kids' reading journey.
Yeah, we've thrown a lot of information at you today, but hopefully it's been helpful and given you some food for thought. And maybe even spark some ideas for how you can get involved in the lives of those school-age kids around you. So on that note, here's something to ponder as you go about your day. Think about the small, consistent ways you might already be, or could start to be, a part of those kids' literacy lives. It might be reading aloud, talking about books, helping with homework, even just creating a space where reading is valued and encouraged. Those seemingly small efforts, when you kind of approach them with this knowledge we've talked about today, well, they can add up to a pretty significant impact. So what stood out to you from our conversation? What resonated the most? And as you think about those school-age readers in your life, maybe consider those different reading skills we talked about. How do they connect with your own experiences? Or, what questions do you still have about supporting young readers? That's something to chew on as you head back out into the world. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive.
Thanks for listening.